Well, hi there. How are you? I'm glad you could come by today because I'm going to share with you a story that is dedicated to my son Connor. Because when he was a young man, a young boy, I started making up the story and reading it to him at bedtime. And it evolved over the years. And I think maybe you'll enjoy it. And also to Reese and to Mila and to Ben and to Vivi. I hope you guys enjoy it too. It's called The Monster in the Woods. And this is chapter 1. The routine. Once there lived a boy in the grand state of Washington. He lived deep in the wood, next to the edge of a vast forest of towering evergreens and majestic oaks that swept from the dirt and gravel road where his modest blue house and big backyard sat. Miles away was the base of a mountain, and the boy and his small black dog lived there with his mother and father, who were writers. In the age of global communication, they were able to live out on the back roads, sending their work via the internet to their publishers far away in Seattle. So here the boy lived in a quiet life. He had a routine he followed almost every day. He would wake up in his second floor room at 5 a.m. and toss on his old faded overalls and his tan Carhartt jacket and stumble down the stairs to do his morning chores. His little black dog was already waiting for him at the back of the door, prancing to go out. They kept a golden Guernsey cow whose name was Bessie. She needed to be milked twice a day, and Connor's job in the morning and afternoon was just that. First, he would get her a bucket of oats from the bin by their small barn, and she would follow him into the milking stall. Connor did not mind the work. He liked Bessie. She was a gentle cow, and on chilly mornings, he would sit on the short three-legged milking stool and lean against her warm flank while she would contentedly let him pull the steaming rich milk into the bucket with a rhythmic swish, swish, swish. Afterwards, he took the milk inside so that his mother could set it aside to separate, as his father cleaned Bessie's stall and the chicken coop. While his parents did this, Trouble, his dog, would look for eggs that seemed their 5 chickens like to hide around the backyard. Trouble was an excellent egg finder, and he looked forward to this game every day. Once their eggs were brought into the house, he would go upstairs and get ready for school, washing up and changing into slightly nicer clothes. At 6, he would arrive downstairs where breakfast would be waiting. After breakfast, at 6:45, he would walk through the dim light to the edge of the road and await the rickety yellow bus that would take him to a small but pleasant rural school. At 4-ish, he would return home and do his chores in reverse, then come into the house, where his mother would be preparing supper, while his father would usually be kicked back next to the wood stove, reading the newspaper and working out a crossword puzzle. After supper, he would do his homework, then would play for an hour or so before it was time to take a bath and get ready for bed. All clean in his PJs, he would lie in bed and read from the soft light on his bedside table. Some nights, he would turn off the light and stare out through the big picture window of his room into the backyard and watch for the flickering reflections from the eyes of many different animals that lived past the 8-foot fence that separated their yard from the beginning of the wilderness beyond. He could recognize many of the eyes, like old friends, deer, owls, raccoons, and even the occasional bear. It was a comfortable life, and with his head full of wonder from whatever mystery book or monster story he was reading at the time, he would drift off into sleep. Little did he know, his life was about to take a dramatic turn. Chapter 2, The Strange Eyes. That was how most days passed at Connor's house. It was a routine that was comfortable and secure. They didn't have a lot of money, but they enjoyed their simple lives. Then one night, everything changed. The day went by as usual, and Connor was in bed reading with his flashlight. Trouble was already asleep at his feet, when without notice, he jumped up. He stood up on the bed and bent his head one way, and then the next, staring out the big window into the backyard. The motion detector light had kicked on and was shining its bright beam through the fence into the forest. There was nothing abnormal about this. It would often turn on when the odd deer was approaching the fence, smelling the tasty vegetables in the garden beyond their reach. Suddenly, the little dog seemed to stare more intently and begin a growl in a low, deep rumble, sort of like this. Trouble had been raised his whole life here and was used to the menagerie of creatures that tried to breach the fence. This odd growling made Connor look out. At first, he didn't see anything, but as he turned off his flashlight and his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw them. Two large, green glowing discs, higher than the fence at what seemed to be beyond the tree line, only 10 feet from the fence. Connor got quietly out of bed and moved softly across the hardwood floor to kneel at the window. He stared at the luminescent discs. His mind raced to categorize what animal it could be. They were way too tall for any bear, and much bigger than even the biggest owls. They seemed to be as large and as round as a couple of dinner plates, deep in green, and looked like that even if the light shut down, they would continue to grow. Not grow. Light. That even if the light shut down, they would continue to glow. He must have stared at them for 10 minutes and was about to go get his dad when just as suddenly, as they had appeared, they went out. The next morning at breakfast, he told his dad and mom about the strange experience and Trouble's weird reaction. His dad seemed to think about it for a minute, then said, "Well, son, I don't know what you saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But if you see them again, come and get me right away." Connor sat eating, slowly and silently pondering what he saw, and decided that his dad was probably right. I mean, what else could it be? Yeah, he thought to himself, a trick of the light. What else could it be? Chapter 3, The Chickens Go Nuts. Everything was back to normal for the next couple of days. No strange eyes, no growling, nada. He had begun to forget all about the strange incident, and everything seemed okay. That night he went to sleep and drifted off into a deep slumber. Suddenly the light in the backyard came on, and the fence sounded like it was being hit by a tank. The chickens went wild, scrambling in all directions. Connor sat straight up in bed and looked out the window, and in abject horror, he saw those giant green eyes pressed almost against his window. He was so terrified he couldn't even get a scream to escape from his lungs, but Trouble had no such fear and rushed to the window barking like a mad dog. Whatever it was startled and disappeared from view. That broke the spell on Connor's terror, and he jumped from his bed, rushing down the hall to get his dad. His father was already in the hall, though, with his jacket on, pulling the shotgun off the rack that hung next to his bedroom. "Stay in the house," he said sternly, and disappeared down the stairs and out the back door. One shot rang out, and then all was quiet. 5 minutes later, he came back in with a concerned scowl. Connor was in the kitchen waiting for him. "What was it?" he inquired. "I don't know," his dad said, "but the shotgun scared it off. Let's go back to bed. We can check it out better in the morning." Chapter 4, Strange Findings. After a fitful night of sleep, Connor groggily pulled himself from bed and turned off his alarm. At first, he was tired. As the night's events seeped through his muddled brain, though, he began to wake up and got excited. He threw on his clothes and scrambled down the stairs. His father was already awake and having a cup of coffee by the back door, next to the old wood stove in the corner of the kitchen. His shotgun was leaning against the wall, and he looked like maybe he had sat there all night long. "Good morning," his dad said with a tired grin, and they went out to do their chores. The sun was just beginning to brighten. The clouds were softly glowing in shades of magenta and tangerine, with the occasional dark blue patch still dotted with a few bright stars. Since it wasn't bright enough to see, Connor found Bessie and took her to milk her. She looked back at him with her large, soft brown eyes, and almost looked like she was trying to tell him that she was a little nervous. After the milking, he and Trouble slowly wandered the yard, exploring the chickens' favorite nooks for eggs. When they got to whatever had come over the fence, his dad was there with his hands on his hips and a puzzled expression on his face, staring at the bent-down pole that went across and braced the top of the fence. "What was it, Dad?" Connor asked. "I'll be darned if I know," his father replied. Connor was inspecting the fence more closely when he noticed Trouble sniffing something on the ground. "What do you got there, boy?" he asked. Trouble gave it another sniff and a woof. Combination sneeze. Kind of like, Connor squatted down to look. On the ground was a tuft of coarse fur, about the size of a softball. He picked it up and felt it was kind of a cross between deer fur and softer bear fur. Both Connor had inspected before. It was getting late, so Connor shoved the fur ball in his pocket and went into the house. Getting ready for school, when he was taking off his coat in his room, he took the tuft out of his pocket and set it on his desk. He thought he would look at it closer after school. He didn't notice, but a small piece of the wad broke off and fell into his old pair of tennis shoes that were half tucked under his old wood desk, where he kept all sorts of odds and ends. He cleaned up and got ready for school. When he got home, everything seemed normal, and he fell into his old routine. Miss Bailey, the pastor's wife, had made some chocolate chip cookies and dropped them off on a social call earlier that afternoon. She knew Connor liked them. After his chores, he didn't have homework and remembered the fur, so he grabbed a handful of cookies and started heading up the stairs for his room. "Hold up there, bucko," his mom said. "You can have one, put the rest back. I don't want you spoiling your supper." So he put all but one back and started up the stairs. His mom called after him, "While you're up there, spray some odor begone on those old shoes. They're stinking up the whole room." So before Connor went to his room, he made a side trip to the supply closet at the end of the hall. He opened up the door and retrieved a spray bottle of odor begone from the dozen or so bottles that lined the shelves. Living so far from any sizable town, his mom liked to buy things in bulk from Costco when they got to the city. Last time they had a sale on odor begone, and she got in a case of 24 and had stashed it around the house. On their small farm, she said, it was her defense against chaos and helped her maintain civility in a barbaric world. He didn't quite know what she meant, but did get rid of the funk, which he had to admit his old shoes had developed. He sat at his desk and uncovered his microscope that he had gotten for Christmas last year. He flicked on the light and placed a tuft of hair on the slide under the lens. He brought it into focus, and a quiet "wow" escaped from his lips. What appeared to be brown with normal eyes, close up, was actually a myriad of colors, reds, greens, and purple strands all mixed together. He heard his mom call him down for supper and was just about to go when he remembered the shoes. "Be right there," he called. Then he kneeled down to spray the shoes. Just as he was pulling the trigger, he noticed a bit of fur that had fallen to one of them. As the spray hit it, small sparks began to dance around. Then a bit of smoke seemed to ooze from the entire wad. Trouble began to prance, woof, 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 and prance around the shoes as the hair started to glow brighter and brighter, until suddenly, with a poof and a flash, it was gone. "Holy crap," Connor shouted. Trouble barked in agreement. He heard his mom call again, so he put it out of his head and went down to supper. Chapter 5, All is Well Until. Connor meant to mention the weird hairball explosion to his mom and dad, but he kind of thought that they might think he was playing with fire in his room again, especially after the coffee can experiment went wrong last month, and he set off the smoke alarm on his ceiling. So he quietly ate his supper and thought about it to himself. Trying to puzzle out why that would happen, he thought maybe he would Google it later, but after supper, he started to finish the book, The Day the Tripods Came. And in case you haven't read that book, it was my favorite book when I was about, I'd say about 12 or 8 years old. It's a really good book. You should read it. He got so into the book, he just forgot. The next morning was really nice. The sun was rising a bit earlier now, and it was almost a clear morning. It had rained the night before, and it smelled fantastic outside. He almost hated finishing his chores. He could have spent more time outside just breathing in the fresh scented air. After breakfast, he ambled off to the bus stop and had a great day at school. They were working on a section in science using electricity to separate water into hydrogen and oxygen. There were lots of exploding experiments, and they watched a video of a hydrogen-filled airship called the Hindenburg catch fire and burn up in just minutes. It was terrifying and cool at the same time. His teacher explained that is why they use helium in airships now, because it's non-flammable. Every day, Monday through Thursday, seemed like a new adventure. The weather was great, and school was interesting, and nothing strange happened. At the house, Connor had put the entire creature scare right out of his head. Friday promised to be just as good as the rest of the week. He was really happy to see his friends as he got on the school bus. And school went great. He was having a good time. At recess, they played kickball, and he kicked a home run. winning the game for his team. As they were walking back into the school, he had a weird feeling come over him. He suddenly felt like his stomach twisted into a knot, and he felt a little dizzy. He stopped and leaned back against the cool red brick wall by the playground door. Mrs. Fiddler noticed and asked if he was okay. He said he was and tried to shake it off and went inside. The rest of the day was kind of a blur. He had a feeling like this once before, and when he got home, found out that Trouble had almost been hit by a car and almost killed. When he told his mom, she said that some people were just more sensitive to psychic vibrations around them. It ran on her side of the family. He was worried, but she told him it was kind of like being a Jedi. So he thought, well, that's cool. And it hadn't happened again until now. He tried to focus on his work, but he was just in a daze. As he rode the school bus home, he didn't speak to anyone. When he finally got to his stop, he nearly bolted off the bus and ran up the long drive to his house. When he rushed through the porch, he knew something was wrong immediately. First of all, Trouble was on the porch barking frantically and scratching on the door of the house. Sometimes his mom would let him come out here, and he could just sit on the windowsill and watch the occasional cars go by. On the dirt road, he liked the smells of the wind as they wafted around through the porch, and it was better than the backyard because the chickens liked to follow him around and bother him. "What's wrong, boy?" he asked. "Why aren't you in the house?" He carefully opened the door and hollered inside, "Mom? Dad?" No reply. Then he smelled something burning and went into the kitchen. Smoke was billowing out of the oven door. He grabbed an oven mitt and the fire extinguisher from the wall and cautiously opened the door. The cookie pan was in there with 12 black smoldering discs that must have been cookies at one time. He dumped them into the sink and turned the faucet on and turned the oven off. He noticed that the newspaper was on the floor and his dad's reading glasses were lying in a twisted pancake like they'd been stomped on. He was about to call out again when he turned toward the back door, and I should say where the back door used to be. Now there was just a giant gaping hole that went from the ceiling to the floor, about as wide as three people standing shoulder to shoulder. Chapter 6. Ready, set, go. Connor was in shock. He just sat on the floor and stared at the hole. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, but suddenly he noticed trouble looking at his face, so he shook himself and started to think. He knew right away that whatever made the hole must have been the creature that had climbed the fence. He started carefully looking around. There was no blood, so at least that was good. He stepped over the rubble and into the backyard. The fence bent in on the top, and some of the heavy wire strands that held it to the posts were broke. It sort of billowed and bowed and flopped in an odd way, but mostly it was still upright. The chicken seemed to be nervous, and he found Bessie clearly rattled and hiding behind the barn, but unharmed. He needed time to think, but not too much time. So he got the oats and took Bessie in the barn and milked her. As he thought, she had to be milked twice a day, or the milk inside her would begin to cause her pain. The steady rhythm of the milking was meditative and helped clear his mind. He thought about calling the police, but they wouldn't believe him. He knew it. A monster kidnapping his parents, come on. For that matter, he didn't know anyone he could tell. He thought, I need to go after them myself, but how will I ever fight a giant monster? Then he remembered the Eau de Begone and began to formalize a plan in his head. First of all, he went to his room and opened the big chest at the end of his bed. He had accumulated a sizable armory of super soakers over the years. He chose his two most powerful pistols and his big battery-powered Master Blaster. He grabbed his flashlight and duct taped it to the end of the barrel, then dumped his backpack on the bed. Returning to the end of the wall, he scooped up all 12 bottles of Eau de Begone into his arms and ran back. He filled the guns and put the leftover bottles in his backpack. Then he scrambled around and got his compass and his cold steel knife and a lighter from his mom's nightstand that she kept for lighting candles. He changed from his tennis shoes into his hiking boots and grabbed his warm Columbia jacket and stuffed it into his pack. Now he went down the stairs and raided the kitchen, grabbing a few apples, some cheese sticks, some juice boxes, and he threw together several turkey sandwiches and closed the pack. It was a little heavy, but he loosened the straps and put it on. Then he loosened his belt a bit and tucked the pistols in. He looked at the kitchen clock. It was 5:15. He knew it would be light past 8, but still, that didn't give him much time. He was moving too fast to be scared and walked to where the fence bowed down. He stomped on the fence and it almost flattened to the ground. "Come on, Trouble," he said, and they scrambled over the flattened fence. Connor kept his weight on it until Trouble was across, and then took his foot off. It sprang up some, but he still found a good-sized branch on the ground and pushed the fence to a more upright position, wedging the branch into the grass to hold it so the chickens would be safe. Chapter 7, Into the Woods. Connor took a deep breath and studied the trees for a second. It must have been difficult being stealthy while holding two people, because it was easy to see the path the monster took. He set out at once, Trouble running a little bit ahead, sniffing the ground here and there. They trudged on for what must have been an hour or more before they came upon an obstacle. The path led them right to a rocky-faced cliff that was nearly vertical and flat. Connor looked left and Connor looked right, then up and down. He couldn't see how even a giant could climb the cliff. There wasn't even the smallest toe or handhold. It looked like it must have been at least 300 feet straight up and carved from a solid, nearly flat granite by some tectonic shift in the earth millions of years ago. He looked down at Trouble, who was staring back at him with a quizzical look. "Well, boy," he said, "if they didn't go up, they must have went left or right, but which way?" The ground here was grassy, and he couldn't make out any definite tracks. Trouble sniffed around, then ran off to the right. Connor decided to trust Trouble's nose and followed. They walked for maybe an hour or more when Trouble stopped and began to sniff in circles. "What is it?" Connor asked. Trouble looked at him and gave him a woof. Connor stopped and looked at the cliff. It was different here. There was a jagged crack that ran on a diagonal angle along the face, creating a sort of natural stair, but for giant legs, with each step being about 3 feet high. As Connor was studying this, he noticed something about 20 feet up, fluttering in the breeze. He carefully climbed up to it, and with the light, discovered that it was a piece of his mother's baking apron. He scrambled back down to the nervous dog and showed it to him. "Look, boy," he said, "Mom's leaving breadcrumbs." Trouble woofed. Chapter 8, Up the Stairs. It was beginning to get a little chilly, so Connor got his jacket out and put it on. After re-slinging the backpack, he unzipped his coat about halfway and tucked Trouble inside. It wasn't an easy climb, but steadily they made their way up. About halfway up, the cliff came upon a ledge. It was about 8 feet wide and 20 feet across. It was recessed into the cliff face. You couldn't see it from the bottom, so he hadn't noticed it before. At the back of the ledge, the cave entrance disappeared into the blackness that suggested it was deep. A few small shrubs grew from around an opening, and as Connor approached it, he noticed a large white stone behind one of the shrubs. He was bending down to look at it closer when he gasped and nearly backed off the edge. What he took as a rock was actually a bleached white human skull. He regained his composure and took Trouble from his coat and set him down. Together they looked at the skull and found the rest of the skeleton was tucked behind the shrub and was dressed in tattered, threadbare, weathered, deteriorated clothes, sitting with its back against the cliff. On its lap was an old leather bag, worn by the elements into a state of decay, but still closed. Connor picked it up and inspected it. He pulled the crackling flap open and looked inside. "Look here, boy," he said to Trouble. "There's a book or something." Although damaged by uncounted years, he found he could carefully open it. The pages were fragile but still intact. It appeared to be a journal, and he flipped gently until he got to the last page. It read, "To whoever finds this, beware of the cave that lies here. Inside, as preposterous as it may seem, lives a very real monster. After I discovered that my friends had disappeared from their cabin, I took it upon myself to find the cause of their mysterious vanishing. Cautiously, I explored for weeks, until by chance, I ran into a band of friendly natives and told them of my plight. They said they knew what had happened, for it was part of their knowledge, handed down from generation to generation by the elders in their tribe. They called this creature the monster who sleeps. They said that every 30 years he comes down from his cave and takes two people having a taste for human flesh. After consuming them, he hibernates for another 3 decades and then does it again. Everyone that has tried to stop it has failed and never returned. I thought I would be the first, but alas, I failed. There is a secret trap 100 feet or so inside the cave. Beware, for suddenly as I crossed a beam of light, a huge blade swept out from the wall and cut my feet off just above my ankles. I know that I don't have much more time. I can feel the life draining from me. But if my warning serves you, then my effort won't have been in vain. Connor solemnly closed the journal and respectfully put it back in the satchel, placing it back on the lap of the skeleton. He thought for a moment how he might have ended up without the warning. What a terrible way it must have been to go. He took a deep breath and tucked Trouble back into his coat. Just for a little while, boy, he said. Trouble seemed to understand and didn't raise a fuss, so he turned the flashlight on and stepped into the cave. Chapter 9. Into the Dark Abyss. Connor didn't quite know how far 100 feet was, but he knew it couldn't be far. As it turned out for him, the line was marked, because not far in, a beam of light sweeping on a slight angle from a hole in the cave made a line in the dusty air. It was pretty easy to see. Then as he shone his flashlight off the muzzle of his guns, this way and that across the floor, he discovered the skeletal remains of the journalist's feet. Connor had brought a long branch with him he had broken from the shrubs. Standing as far back as he could, he threw it through the beam. Something flashed across the floor and into a slit in the rock on the other side. He had to think for a moment on what to do, but eventually he just found a rock about the size of a bowling ball and rolled it into the receiving slit. Then he went out and got another branch and threw this through the beam. This time the blade slashed out with a loud clang and it hit the rock and stopped. That's the easy one, he told Trouble. We knew it was there. I wonder how many other tricks there are. As cautious as they could, they pressed forward. It was difficult to keep track of time in the pitch black. They had lost the light of the entrance a long ways back. Fortunately, the cave didn't branch much. And when it did, he could see easily the branches were full of stalactites and stalagmites, so it was clear that was not the right path. In the echoing stillness, Connor began to hear a sound like the drip from a leaking faucet. The dripping got louder and louder until the cave opened up, and before them lay a huge underground lake. It stretched out farther than Connor's light could shine. It just seemed to go on and on, forever eating the bright beam of his flashlight. The ceiling was maybe 100 feet above them. He could just see the reflection of the flashlight dancing on the jagged roof. He stood on the edge for a while, shining his light this way and that, looking for a path or some clue on which way to go. To the left, the lake looked a little different, and Trouble was starting to squirm to get out. I guess it's safe now, boy, he said, and unzipped his coat. Setting the small dog on the ground, Trouble explored the edge of the cliff that dropped into the lake, while Connor stood pondering about what was different about the darkness to the right. Then he got an idea and turned off his light, and sure enough, he could see what he expected. Off in the distance, there was a dim red glow. It seemed to vary in intensity and color. He turned his light back on and continued to explore the lake's edge. At first he thought the wall of the opening dropped straight into the lake, but upon closer inspection, he could see a narrow ridge that ran along it, curving off into the darkness towards the red glow. He was just turning to tell Trouble that he found which way they should go, when the water erupted where Trouble sniffed. They both jumped back as a giant fish flashed in the air and almost had Trouble in his gaping maw. "Holy cow!" Connor shouted, and Trouble let out a yelp of fear. Cautiously, they got it and with trepidation looked over the edge into the water 6 feet below. There was some sort of enormous catfish with bulbous eyes the size of basketballs. The smallest of the fish looked at least as big as a small car. They crowded the edge of the lake and their monstrous maws gaped and opened and closed, sucking water through their gills. "You were almost fish food," Connor said. Trouble looked up at him, cocking his head in interest. "I think I found the way around. How to get past these fish." Suddenly he had an idea. He unslung his pack and dug through it for the sandwiches he had made. Before he left, "Let's see if these dudes like turkey," he said out loud. He balled the sandwich, and with all of his strength, he whipped it as far as he could into the lake. The sandwich came apart as it sailed into the distance and hit the water with several small splashes. As soon as it made contact, the water churned furiously, and with a splash, the fish raced off to where it landed. "Let's go, boy," Connor shouted. As fast as he could, they started to move around the lake's edge. He kept the pack off and kept looking back at the path in the lake for returning fish. They had gone quite a ways when Trouble gave a warning bark. Connor shined his flashlight into the water and he could see several of the creatures returning. He took another sandwich and hurled it away into the darkness. He heard the splash, and so did the fish. They quickly turned back and went towards the noise. "I wonder what they eat when they can't get boy or dog," Connor exclaimed. Trouble did not reply, but seemed anxious just to keep moving as fast as they could. Twice he had to throw food in the water, and that was down to their last 4 sandwiches. When they came to the end of the path, there before them was a glowing red hole, not bright, but still clear in the darkness. At this point, Connor didn't care what was in the new path. He was just glad to get away from the water. Chapter 10, Reunion and Rescue. As they crept quietly down this new tunnel, the glow seemed to get brighter and brighter. Also, it flickered like a campfire, casting eerie shadows that took on goblin shapes in Connor's mind from the stalactites that were protruding here and there from the floor. Finally, he could see a turn ahead that was very bright, so he turned off his flashlight, and they took extra care to be silent as he could. Cautiously, he peeked around the corner. There was a fire in a big pit in the center of a vast room. Over the fire was a big black pot, about the size of a big hot tub and much deeper. In the pot, up to their necks in water, were his mom and dad. They were back and back, and he assumed they were tied. It was all Connor could do not to cry out, but he knew that this was the monster's home, and he didn't want to be foolish. So holding Trouble by the collar, he scanned the cavern. As his eyes got used to the light, he could see an odd assortment of piles scattered here and there. It was kind of odd, but it seemed like the monster had sorted the belongings of his victims in the past. One pile was a collection of weapons. Everything from spears and bows and arrows, swords from various eras, rifles and pistols, all in a heap, like the world's most unorganized museum. Also, there were lots of clothes, and in one pile was an open chest full of coins glittering in the firelight. The one thing that was missing, to Connor's delight, was the monster. Connor could hear his dad talking to his mom. They were trying to get out of the ropes, and his mom was clearly uncomfortable. He didn't know how long they had been in the pot, but the water must have been heating up to the point where if they didn't get out soon, they would be badly hurt. "Mom, Dad," Connor sort of whispered, as loud as he could. His parents looked his way with a startled expression. "Connor?" his mom exclaimed. "What are you doing here?" "Never mind that now," his dad said. "Just get us out." Connor looked around the room and spotted a long branch, like a pole, that the monster had not yet broken into firewood. It was heavy, but he managed to lift it against the side of the pot. His dad and mom came over to the edge and braced it with their bodies as best they could while Connor climbed up. Trouble paced the room below, keeping lookout. Connor got his knife out and cut easily through the ropes that bound his parents. Then he climbed down and held it steady while his parents climbed out. It was a little embarrassing because the monster had stripped them naked before putting them in the pot. But his dad came first and held the makeshift ladder while his mom climbed down. Connor went to the pile of weapons and began to rummage through them, while his mom and dad quickly retrieved their clothes from the clothes pile and joined him. "Where is the monster?" Connor asked. "I don't know," his dad replied. "I think he went to get more wood." "But how?" Connor said. "I didn't see him on the way in." "There's another entrance across the way," his mom said. "How did you find us?" As quickly as he could, he told him what he had been through. "Well, we better get out now," his dad said. "We'll take your way." Just then, Trouble started to bark and growl like crazy as the monster came through the door. And seeing his captors free, he bellowed out so loud that it hurt Connor's ears. The monster was a shaggy tangle of fur, 10 feet tall. With a huge head, he spun, trying to make a decision on whom to go for first. Connor's parents were on opposite sides of the room, and Trouble was running around in a circle, barking and taunting him with small bites on his shaggy ankles. Finally, he decided to go for Connor and started at him. Connor glanced toward the opening of the room where he had set his pack and super soakers while he was rescuing his mom and dad from the pot. He decided quickly that he would not have time to retrieve them before the monster reached him. So he grabbed a short cutlass from the pile and stood his ground, waiting to charge the beast. When he was closer. He lifted the sword above his head and was about to make a feeble effort to rush in when a large stone whizzed across the room, hitting the monster hard in the back of the head. Mad with rage, the monster wheeled around just in time to catch another well-placed throw from his dad right in the nose. Connor saw his mom scurrying in the flickering firelight, looking for good-sized missiles and tossing them at his dad's feet so he would have a constant supply of ammo. The monster temporarily forgot Connor in trouble and began to move with long, fast strides towards his parents. When he was nearly there, a stone-tipped arrow from an ancient bow buried itself right in the monster's furry butt. The creature howled in pain and spun around again towards Connor, who had already dropped the bow and was rushing for the super soakers. His dad was still firing fastballs that pelted the monster from the shoulders up, but he was too enraged to care. He reached back and plucked the arrow from his posterior with one hand as he advanced with surprising speed towards Connor and Trouble, who were just retrieving the biggest of the odor-begone loaded guns. Connor was backed against the wall, and the monster reached down with an evil smirk on his face. His huge clawed hand was reaching out to engulf him and crush him, just as Connor let loose the full force of the deadly fluid, drenching the monster from head to waist. Immediately, the shaggy behemoth sensed something amiss and took a few staggering steps back, wiping the scented spray from his eyes with his arm. This gave Connor enough time to retrieve his pistols and douse the rest of the beast, all the way down to his toes. As the monster began to glow, he didn't seem to be in pain, but instead examined his arms and legs with almost a curious look, and turned away from Connor to avoid more of the spray in his eyes. This gave Connor time to get the extra bottles out of his pack, and not bothering to load his guns, he just pulled off the lids and sloshed the monster with broad swipes right from the bottles. Now the chemicals really started to take effect. The shaggy beast backed against the wall with a strange, horrified look on his ugly face. Connor yelled across the room for his parents to get behind a boulder or something as he scooped up Trouble and dashed around the opening just outside the mouth of the room and held him tight, crouched against the wall of the cave. Connor could not see the monster from his vantage spot, but the light emitting from the room beamed brighter and brighter until it burst from the doorway, like one of those giant spotlights they shine in the clouds and use to promote stuff like grand openings at casinos. Brighter and brighter it shone until it was so bright it hurt Connor's eyes. He covered Troubles and crouched into a ball on the floor. Suddenly, like 1,000 fireworks, with no real noise, a great gush of air burst from the room and blew Connor and Trouble 10 feet down the cave until it subsided, leaving him clutching Trouble on his back, dangerously close to the edge of the lake. "Holy crap!" Connor exclaimed and jumped to his feet. He rushed back into the room, and there was no sign of the monster. The logs from the fire were scattered everywhere, and yet somehow the pot managed to stay in its frame and swung back and forth, sloshing water out with a splashy sizzle at the end of each arch. Actually, he was lucky the logs had shifted with a silent explosion, or the scalding water from the pot would have put it out, leaving the room in total darkness. Chapter 11, The Treasure. "Mom, Dad," Connor whispered as he scanned the room. At first he didn't see anything. There was a lot of smoke that was slowly clearing as it was sucked up into the natural chimney over the fire. Connor and Trouble made their way across the rubble and across the burning logs. The pot had come to a halt and was just hanging now almost in total silence. The only sound Connor could hear was the occasional crackle of the logs as they rekindled and spit sparks here and there. As the light grew, Connor heard a faint cough and looked into the shadows. A large form was there and was beginning to move and rise. Connor fell back and sat hard on the floor, but Trouble rushed towards the now heaving and coughing mass. "No, Trouble!" Connor yelled, but Trouble was ignoring his command and continued forward. Just as he was about to yell again, the pile shifted, and from inside of what Connor now realized had been the collected pile of clothes popped his parents' heads and then shoulders as they shook off the ancient garments they were entangled in. "Mom? Dad?" Connor said. "Son," his dad replied, as Connor rushed into their arms. After a long hug, they began to make a plan under his dad's guidance. They got some of the rusty spears and pushed the burning logs back into the pit. The flames quickly grew, and the room began to grow much brighter. As they worked, Connor explained with awe in his parents' faces about the super soakers and the odor begone and the rest of his journey through the woods, cliff, and cave. Amazed, his parents recounted their horrifying experience of being surprised and kidnapped by the monster. They told him they never expected to be rescued and were so worried about him. During their explorations of the room, they found some old lanterns that still had kerosene in them. It was a little thick with age, but usable. They lit them up and explored the room in more detail. Where the monster had been, there was a white ash silhouette on the wall like a reverse shadow. No other trace of it could be found, nor any other clues to what it had been or where it had come from. They also found a big chest full of currency and coins, gold and silver mostly, from different parts of the earth. Most of the clothes had been destroyed, but the pile of weapons was mostly intact, and because the monster had apparently kept this room dry, they were in a remarkable state of preservation. In a side room off the main area, to their horror, they found a large pile of human bones, bleached clean and grim. Obviously, the monster's former victims from past ages. Sobered by this sight and coming down from the adrenaline rush of their adventure, they retreated to the main room and made a nest of sorts from the scraps of clothes. Connor retrieved his backpack and they shared some of the foodstuff and water he had left, saving a bit for the catfish that he explained they would need to find their way out. Chapter 12, The Return Home. After resting a bit, Connor led the way out of the cavern. To Connor, it seemed to go faster on the way out, probably because he knew what to expect, and they still had the kerosene lanterns, which lit up the whole cave better than his flashlight. His mom and dad were amazed by the lake and the giant catfish, but with the exception of having to stop trouble from jumping into them, their journey was uneventful. When they stepped out into the light, they were surprised to see the sun was already up and bright in the sky. They had spent the whole night and part of the morning in the monster's lair, but had lost their watches to the beast and didn't realize how much time had passed. Although exhausted, they were eager to get home as quickly as they could. They followed the easy trail back to their battered fence of their house. They really wanted just to go to bed. Bessie was uncomfortable. She hadn't missed her morning milking and they had a huge hole to board her up. So Connor took care of the animals while his dad patched the hole that the monster had made when he burst the door frame. His mom cleaned up and organized the messed up kitchen, then helped his dad with the patch. There was a message from Connor's school because he had been absent. So his mom called and said he wasn't feeling well, and being Thursday, she would just keep him home the rest of the week. They all hit the sack about 7:30 and slept right until 5 a.m. when it was time to get up and take care of the animals again. They could have slept the whole day, but one thing you learn when you're young is that when you have animals, whether they're pets or farm animals, they have to be attended to because they depend on you. After breakfast, they had a powwow around the kitchen table and discussed what they should do. After a long debate, of which Connor mostly listened, they decided that without the monster, no one would believe their story. So Connor's dad contacted an old friend from the university who taught anthropology and told him that his family had been on a hike and made a huge discovery. The professor came to the house, so they returned to the cave with their quads and lots of sandwiches for the fish. The find in the cave was huge. It made national and international news. Connor and Trouble were very popular for at least a month, but they avoided too many questions and directed the reporters to Dad's professor friend. They really just didn't want to have to make up a story, so they let the scientists try to figure out the mystery. After a month or so, things began to quiet down. It was clear to the scientists that most of the remains were very old and some of them ancient. The skeleton of the man with the journal was written off to be delusional. The silhouette on the wall of the monster was eventually dismissed as a prehistoric cave painting. As usual, if science doesn't like things that don't fit into their box, they brush it under the rug of scientific blindness. So the cave was recorded as a barbarous prehistoric tribe with cannibalistic tendencies. Although the college museum got all the artifacts, Connor's family received generous compensation for the find and never had to worry much about money again. It changed their lives. Very little though, being people who love life and not things. They got a new truck and they all got new computers and a few more things that they needed. Besides that, life just settled back to normal. Really, in the long run, the catfish made the biggest news, being a new species. Since Connor discovered them, they let him name them. Thus, the giant catfish are now officially called Angustia paraphyletic, or in English, troublefish. And that's the end of the story. Hope you enjoyed it. Sleep tight, my friends. Sweet dreams. Good night.